Whether you love her or you're not a fan, Carole Baskin has become a household name across the country.
The founder and CEO of Big Cat Rescue in Florida is one of the breakout stars of Netflix's hit show Tiger King.
The popular series follows the lives of big cat conservationists, collectors, and breeders. It also highlights the long-standing feud between Baskin and arch nemesis Joseph Maldonado Passage, aka Joe Exotic, the former owner of the WYZZ Animal Park in Oklahoma.
Here in central Illinois, big cats are in the spotlight again following the June closure of Brown's Oak Ridge Zoo in Fulton County, which has animal trading ties to Joe Exotic.
Now, Joe is currently serving a 22-year federal prison sentence for his role in a murder-for-hire plot against Baskin and for violating federal wildlife laws. But we did get a chance to speak with Carole Baskin last week in an all-access interview.
No question off limits, no topic untouched.
Well, after 30 years, Brown's Oak Ridge Zoo right here in central Illinois has shut down. And earlier this year, Carole, managers at the zoo told us that they did do some trade exchanges with Joe Exotic for about 15 years. And they told us that those animals were always in good health. But what's your response now to the zoo shutting down? And what does this mean for exotic animals?
I really appreciate that the silver lining in all of the horrible things that were said in Tiger King about me is that so many of these places are now closing down. And so many of the people that you saw in Tiger King have been indicted. They've lost their license to own the animals. This particular one you're talking about, I don't think it was actually in Tiger King, but it is seeing the trickle-down effect of we don't want to be caught in this net either, and so they are closing down. And it has just been such a long time in coming, and I'm so thankful that these animals will finally end up in decent places where they won't be exploited any longer.
And you know, on December 3rd, the House passed the Big Cat Public Safety Act, something that you and your husband Howard spent thousands of dollars lobbying for. You know, for those who aren't super familiar with the bill, can you just explain it for us and also what it means for big cats?
The bill does two things. It stops the cub handling. It makes that illegal where you pay to have your picture made with a cub, and it phases out private possession. So people who currently have big cats, lions, tigers, leopards, they can keep them. They just have to register with the state to say this is how many I have, and then they can't buy or breed more. And so over time, usually I would say probably in the next 5 to 10 years, those animals will die out in private possession. And that will end the practice of keeping these animals in backyards and basements. The reason that the cub petting is so important to stop is because that generates hundreds of cubs, because they can only be used for about a 1-month window between the time that they're too small and the time that they can take a finger off of a child. And so they have to have a constant supply of these cubs. And so GWZoo and all of these other people that you saw in Tiger King are just constantly pumping out as many cubs as they can to fill that market, that demand for people to have their picture made with a cub. So if you make that part illegal, it stops all of that breeding, and that stops all of the discarding. As soon as they get to be 12 to 16 weeks old, they end up being dumped into backyards and basements or into the illegal trade for their parts. So that's why it's so important to stop that flow so that we can actually save the tiger in the wild. Whenever you're breeding that many cats and dumping them into the environment, you're causing a legal smokescreen, because it's currently legal to do all of that, that is a cover for the illegal activities like poaching.
Now, Carole, I got to ask you, your nonprofit in Florida, Big Cat Rescue, you guys have exotic cats, right? And while you're not having those cub handlings of sorts, you do have those cats in enclosures. And before COVID-19, people did come to see your cat. So what sets you apart? What sets your mission apart from what you're claiming this legislation is doing, and also claims against Joe Exotic and other folks that were featured in the Tiger King film?
You're correct. That is the one thing that we have in common. Both zoos and sanctuaries have big cats in cages. We have about 54 exotic cats here at the sanctuary. The difference is the philosophy. Zoos are in the business of breeding and exhibiting and allowing, very few of them do it, but a few of them allow the pay-to-play schemes. And sanctuaries are in the business of trying to put ourselves out of business because we have to rescue those animals who end up in horrible situations where law enforcement has to go in and seize them in some situations. And so we give them a place where they can live out the rest of their lives in sanctuaries. But sanctuaries don't buy, they don't breed, they don't sell, they don't trade in the animals, they don't allow any public contact, and they don't take them off site, like out to circuses and fairs and malls and those kinds of things. So the fundamental difference between any legitimate sanctuary and a zoo is what they're in business to do.
Yeah, and more recently as well, Big Cat Rescue did make some headlines after a volunteer got her arm bitten and she was injured. So we did want to ask you just, how it even happened and how's the woman now and also what happens to the cat?
Well, nothing will happen to the cat. He was doing what tigers do. And the thing that upsets me so much about this, in addition to this wonderful volunteer who we all love and her fighting right now to save her arm, but what upsets me so much is that these people who have been paying to pet cubs are creating that entire industry that causes all of these animals to have to be rescued by legitimate sanctuaries where people are donating their time and their resources to clean up the mess that is left behind because our government has failed, absolutely failed to regulate this trade. And, even though it passed the House last Thursday, it's still stuck in the Senate now. All the Senate has to do is get on the phone and say, let's pet it on a hotline. And they call every office and say, does anybody oppose it? As long as nobody opposes it, then it passes. And nobody on the Senate side and the Republican part of the Senate side, of course, the Democrats are all ready for this, but we haven't been able to get anyone who is a Republican to be the person to say, I want to save tigers in the wild by pushing this through. And if this horrible accident that happened with our volunteer isn't something that just underscores why this is so necessary, these people shouldn't have to be in a situation where they are at risk of losing life or limb because people are allowed to trade in these animals and exploit them the way they currently can in this country.
I did want to follow up with that, Carole. So how is that woman now, and then what safety protocols will you all be taking?
She's still, I believe, in the hospital. She's still undergoing surgeries. They say that she is in good spirits, and I can believe that because she is an amazing person. As far as the difference in the way we do things going forward from the way that we were doing them, we went over all of our safety protocols again. We had the entire coordinator team meet that evening and went over, every scenario of was there anything that we could have done that would have prevented this as far as the level of training that we give our volunteers. Before, she had been here for 5 years, and so before she could even work around a big cat, she had to be here for 3 years taking care of little cats like bobcats and servals. And she had to go through something like 50 classes that she had to take and pass. And each one of our classes, it says, do not stick any part of your body into a cage. And so if that's already in our training, what more could we do? And what we decided to do was to make that every 6 months, that one safety class that reiterates all of those other safety issues in each one of the other classes. It's all put into one class, and every 6 months, every single one of our people has to take that class again so that it's always top of mind.
So Carole, obviously one of the big reasons you're here, Netflix's Tiger King was released all the way back in March, and it gained a lot of popularity very, very quickly. Walk us through how your life looks very different nowadays.
Yeah, it has been different. And I think it's been especially different because of COVID-19 hitting at the same time. We had shut our gates to public tours on March the 15th due to COVID. And then I think Tiger King came out 5 days later. And so it was like a perfect storm that has just wreaked havoc on all of us. I mean, everybody has really suffered in 2020. But as far as how things are different, it's still, we're still doing the same things we've always done. We're still working on trying to end the abuse of these big cats. We're still taking care of the cats here every day. Thankfully, all of our animal care is done by volunteers. And so there's been no lack in the amount of care that the cats have gotten, and people unfortunately, since they don't have jobs now, a lot of them have a lot more free time. And so the cats are getting more attention than they've ever gotten, which is nice. Um, but we've had to do it with a loss of a third of our income. So by not having those guided tours, we lose like $1 million a year. So that's why I've been on Dancing with the Stars and doing cameos and selling bobbleheads and anything I can do to raise money to keep the cats fed.
Yeah, and I did want to touch on possibly it's the most jaw-dropping episode in the series. That was episode 3, The Secret, where Joe Exotic helped create probably the biggest question that came out of the series, maybe of 2020, which many people are still curious about. And I wanted to ask you this today. What that question was: did you kill Don Lewis, your husband at the time, or were you involved in any way in his disappearance?
No, I wasn't. In fact, that's one of the most egregious things I think the producers of Tiger King did. They called it a documentary when it was just a mockumentary at very best. And I had given them all of the information that they needed to go down to the court records here in Hillsborough County and pull all of the records that happened after the conservatorship. I gave them copies of all the letters that I had back and forth to the sheriff's office during that period of time. And instead, you'll see that I was tried and convicted by a handful of animal abusers and people who tried to take over my business, people who were preying on the fact that Don was really having a lot of trouble mentally and keeping him from getting the medical care that he needed by telling him that I was trying to put him away, that I was going to take all of our money and run with it, just scaring him to death so that he wouldn't go to the doctors that he needed to see, because I didn't know what it was. I thought that it was Alzheimer's because one of our volunteers had a family member with Alzheimer's and said, man, this is just all of the telltale signs. And so I went out and bought like every book I could find on it and started trying to get him medical help. And so part of what they didn't show you in Tiger King is that I did take him to a doctor. Anne McQueen insisted that he go to her doctor instead of the Alzheimer's doctor, but we went there first. He was diagnosed as being bipolar. I took him in for an MRI, and then he disappeared a month later before we had the opportunity to get him to the Alzheimer's doctor. He already had the appointment scheduled, but he disappeared before that happened. And yet none of that was shown in Tiger King because that didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to portray.
More recently, on that same topic, Carole, you're facing litigation from Don's children right now. What can you tell us about the status of that and how you all move forward?
They've actually been dropped from that lawsuit. They were dropped and all of the other defendants were dropped. So the only one currently suing me is Anne McQueen for slander and libel, and we have filed a motion to dismiss that.
Well, lastly, after Whirlwind 2020, obviously you've been involved in a lot, been in the public eye a lot more frequently. You can now add dancer to your list of credentials. Tell us what it was like for you to be a part of ABC's Dancing with the Stars.
I don't think I could add dancer to my list of credentials. I think everybody would agree. That it was
Not your top skill? You wouldn't put that on the top of a resume or something?
My mom told me you can do anything you set your mind to, and I think she was wrong because I clearly could not learn how to dance, and I thought, how hard could it be?
But you tried. You tried.
What was that experience like for you?
It was amazing. I talked to them for a couple of months before going on the show, and I had two really big concerns. One was COVID. My husband and my daughter are both at high risk of contracting COVID. And so I wanted to be sure everything was going to be safe, and they made sure that that was the case. And boy, did they make sure that was the case. They did such an awesome job with that. But the other thing was that my main reason for doing it is I felt like where Tiger King had failed was the animals. People, at least they now know that cub petting industry exists, but there was so much over 5 years that they could have shown as far as the horrible way these animals are treated, the way that they are exploited to the public, the lies that are told to the public, all of that they could have shown. I know they could have shown it because we gave them that information, and they didn't. And so I felt like that was the most important thing I could do, was use that infamy from Tiger King to have every opportunity I could to talk about why we need to save the tiger in the wild before it's too late.
Carole Baskin, thank you so much for your candor and your ability to speak with us. We really appreciate all your time this morning.
Thank you.
She was very open about her experiences.
Very much so, and obviously denying any allegations that she may have killed her at the time husband Don Lewis or was involved in his disappearance. That's probably the biggest question that came out of Tiger King.
That's right. And of course, if you missed any part of that all-inclusive interview, you want to go to CIProud.com. We've got both parts as well as her responses.